Hi guys, and welcome back to the channel. We talk about sharpness so much and it's such an important topic, yet there's one thing basically no one has ever told you about sharpness, and it can make such a big difference in your images. And no, I'm not talking about adding sharpening to your files. I basically never do that. What I'm going to show you in this video may surprise you, but I know it will help you to make your images look so much better and razor sharp. So let's go. Of course, we all do our best in the field to take great looking and razor sharp images. Yet sometimes they just don't come up quite right. Many of these photos are actually nice and sharp, yet they don't look sharp to our eyes at all. I call this phenomenon perceived sharpness. Look at this specific buzzer example, for instance. When we zoom into the bird's head, we can see it's nice and sharp, yet when we zoom out, it doesn't really look sharp at all. So how is that possible? The first time I came across the issue of perceived sharpness was in my life long before YouTube as a real estate photographer. I was managing a team of about 20 photographers and a lot of editors, and we had that one really picky client and they kept saying our images don't look sharp. So the editors would add more sharpening and the response was always the same. Until we discovered that what they were talking about was not the actual sharpness in the images, but the perceived sharpness. And one of the key areas here was they wanted the walls in their houses to be white. But for some reason, in a lot of the photos, they were just too warm with a too warm white balance. So they always kind of looked a bit yellow, a bit dirty. And once we started to neutralize the whites, they were suddenly happy with the photos, even though we didn't change anything about the sharpening at all. And that got me thinking about my own nature photos as well, because obviously in nature, we're also dealing with a lot of color casts. It could be from grass reflecting on a bird's belly or very low sunlight, sort of casting a really warm cast on your subject, or you have some blue cast on a black bird, for instance. And once I started to look into this more, I realized I can actually make my images look so much better and sharper by paying attention to these little things and actually changing them. It's not all about editing though. Some of the perceived sharpness issues we can already tackle in the field. For instance, a bird with a nice and clean background will always appear sharper than a bird that's kind of like sitting in the middle of a bush. So it's not only the actual sharpness of your photos, of course we need that, but also the composition and the perceived sharpness of our images that heavily influences how we view the images and how sharp they actually look in the end. The Pacific Buzzer image from the beginning of this video actually combines a lot of these negative attributes that I just talked about. The file is actually sharp, but it doesn't look sharp because it's too bright, the background is too busy, and overall it just has kind of a weird washed out look that just distracts our eyes and makes the whole image look quite soft, even though it's perfectly sharp. So while we can try to eliminate some of these issues in the field, most of it has to be done when we're editing the files. And I want to show you a few tricks in this video now where you can easily remove things like color cast or deal with the perceived sharpness issues to make your own images look really nice and stand out. The first images of this beautiful white morph reddish egret I photographed one early morning in Florida at Fort DeSoto. The sunrise was pretty low and I had my camera set to auto white balance, which caused it to take the scene in a quite warm sort of setting. So my raw file is quite warm, and while it's sharp, it just doesn't look quite right to our eyes. It feels quite muddy because the white bird is not white and the blue water is kind of not really blue. So simply by cleaning up these two things, we can make a true standout image and make the white bird white, the water blue, and have a nice and crisp looking beautiful image. I did a couple things to this image. First of all, I did a color balance layer where I added a little bit of cyan and a little bit of blue. Then I selected the bird and I went to hue saturation. I pulled down the saturation and I added the lightness on the lightness slider, which allowed me to make the bird really nice and white. And then I selected the background and went into the selective color layer, selected the blue and the cyan channel, and played around there with the sliders until the water looked nice and blue. And from there I did my normal workflow that I teach you in my masterclass as well, a couple curves, a couple layers, and basically the image was done. And I think it's a huge improvement over the too warm, muddy looking raw file. In this first example, we've already seen that it's quite important for our eyes to see colors the way they should be. So a white bird should be white, blue water should be blue, and a black bird should be black. Especially black colors often attract color casts, or they kind of look washed out and gray, especially if you're, for instance, pulling up the shadow slider too much. And one of these birds that's very difficult to edit for me are black cockatoos. They have quite shiny feathers, so attract a lot of crazy color casts, and when the sun shines onto them, they often appear way too bright as well. So in this first example, you can see how the back of the bird looks blue and quite strange, and it just distracts our eyes because we're just drawn to this blue color. So by using a hue saturation layer and pulling out the blue, doing a little bit of selective color and a couple curves, we can easily change the weird cast on the bird and create a much more appealing, great looking overall image. We also have this other example of this red-tailed black cockatoo, a nice head portrait with the crest up, where the bird just looks washed out and gray because it's lacking a lot of contrast in the black feathers. And our eyes want to see the black bird black. They don't want to see it gray because then it just doesn't feel as sharp. So I added a lot of contrast and a lot of darkness with a few curves layers to the bird, and I think improved the image dramatically. And overall, I think it also looks a lot sharper. As you can see in all these examples, it's definitely helpful to learn how to separate the bird from the background through masking. Luckily, there's a lot of sort of automatic subject selection tools now that work pretty well, but even then you should still learn how to refine the masks a little bit more, because it will really help you in doing the selective edits by not just brushing it in, because if you're brushing it in without masks, it's very likely that you're brushing into the background or onto the bird and do things that you don't want to do, and then it just looks quite messy, or you get like halos around the bird, and that's definitely not what we want. And if you want to learn all about these little tricks that I teach you in this video and so much more, I highly recommend that you check out my masterclass, where I teach you exactly all the tricks that you need to know to make your own images look amazing. And I also recommend that you check out my PROSETS to get amazing colors right off the bat. Let's move on to another example where we have a very washed out and too bright looking image, and with just a few changes, a few levels adjustments and a few curves just on the bird and the perch, we're able to make this image look much better and make it appear much sharper. I already mentioned that it's important that black areas look black in an image to actually look sharp to our eyes as well. And this black grassland photo is a great example of this. In the raw file, it kind of looks a bit washed out, has a little green cast, but by removing that cast and adding a lot of contrast to the dark areas, especially the black parts of the birds, we can make the image look so much crisper and so much nicer. Another common problem can be that we're photographing a bird against the background that is just too similar in color to the bird, and it just kind of confuses our eyes. Like in this green catbird example, there was a highlight on the bird's wing, which kind of makes our eyes to go to the wing rather than to the head, and the bird and the background are a little bit too similar in color. So I selected the background and I used the selective color layer on the yellow channel to just shift the color of the background a little bit to separate the bird from the background. And then I used a few curve layers to make the head of the bird and the red eye stand out more, and I darkened the wings so the highlight of the wing disappeared and the spotlight of the bird was now on the bird's head. And I think if we compare the before and the after, you can see that with just a few curves and one selective color layer, we can make our image look much sharper, because now we have the separation between the bird and the background, and the focus is now on the bird's head rather than on the too bright wing. The separation between the background and the bird is not only important when they're quite similar in color, but also when they're like too bright or too dark. In this sunbird example, for instance, the bird and the background were actually too dark. So I selectively brightened the bird, and then I also brightened the background and slightly shifted it again in color with a selective color layer, making it look much nicer, and I think the end result also looks much crisper overall with a slightly more green background and that brightened bird with the focus now on the bird's head and that amazing shiny throat of the bird. And sometimes our images may simply be not 100% sharp, but with the right editing we can still make them look much sharper. And again, I'm not really talking about running it through some sharpening software, editing a lot of sharpness that usually doesn't work and just creates artifacts and look quite strange. What I'm talking about is darkening and adding contrast to selective areas to just make the image look much sharper than it actually is. In this flying pintail example, for instance, we have the raw file that looks quite washed out. There's a strong color cast on the bird's belly, and the bird and the background kind of blend in together, and there's a few dark areas in the background that are also distracting. So I selected the bird and the background so that I can work on them separately. I darkened down the bird's head a lot. I removed the orange color cast on the bird. I added more contrast to the bird, the wings, the whole bird overall. And then I also cleaned up some of the dark areas in the background and lightened the background. And by separating the two and applying a few different layers like levels and curves, I was able to make this not 100% sharp image look quite sharp, didn't I? So if you compare the raw file to the final image, we can see a huge difference in the perceived sharpness. The raw file, no one would really say, "Ooh, that's nice and sharp." But in the final image, that looks really nice, and I actually printed that file and it still looks quite nice. So working on the right areas, like the head in this example, making it much darker, adding saturation to the image as well, just makes a not 100% sharp image look really sharp. And lastly, there's one more thing that we can remove that is quite distracting for our eyes, and that is strange reflections on the bird's beak or on the bird's eye or on the bird's feathers. Oftentimes, especially with ducks, for instance, you get it that instead of the one catchlight in the eye from the sun, you also have a second catchlight in the eye where the sun is reflecting on the water, and that often looks quite strange. So by removing that second reflection, we can make the image look much sharper. So any kind of reflection I usually like to remove from my images because they distract our eyes quite a lot and we don't really know what to look at because there's so many bright spots in the image. So when it comes to editing birds images, my main focus is to separate the bird from the background because that will make it look sharper. And then I like to use curves to darken down areas on the bird that I don't want to see it much and brighten or make areas stand out on the bird that I want to focus on, like the bird's head, or if it has a nice color in the throat, I work on making that stand out. And by bringing out the areas that we want to focus on and kind of dulling down the areas that we don't really want to see, we can make our images appear so much sharper. And of course, color cast is the other big thing that we need to remove from our images. We want gray to be gray, white to be white, black to be black, and blue to be blue. And if we achieve that in our images, they will look just so much sharper simply because our eyes are now not confused anymore. I would love to hear from you guys in the comments. Have you come across the perceived sharpness issue? Is that something you may have noticed in your own photos? Like they are sharp, but they don't look sharp? Can be quite frustrating sometimes. There's a few things we can do in the field, like making sure we have a clean enough background or not shooting the bird in too much clutter. But other than that, it mostly comes down to what we do when it comes to editing our photos. And with a few little tweaks like I showed you in this video, I'm hopeful that you will be able now to go ahead and make your images look so much cleaner and so much sharper. So hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you did, make sure to check out my channel membership as well, where you can join my channel for a small monthly fee and get some cool membership perks. And other than that, make sure to give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in my next video very soon. Bye!